Since we won't have much time to complete our brief study of Hamlet, I've decided to put this concluding presentation online. Now, it will require some little work on your part, so please have your copy of the New Oxford Shakespeare handy opened at Hamlet on page 1997, and be ready to pause the video when asked to do so. Of course, the idea behind everything we do as actors is to turn the hidden figure of the author at left into someone a bit more familiar to us. So, as we did with antithesis and anaphora, I'd now like you to look for another rhetorical device which prevails in Hamlet, the inditus. Now, the inditus is quite simple. It's just two words joined by and it expresses an idea that is more commonly expressed by, well, an adjective and a noun. We've seen this in other plays. For instance, bottom right, there are two examples taken from the two plays we've read. Worthy his youth and nobleness of mind from Two Gentlemen, well, that expresses noble youth. And the tediousness and process of my travel from Richard II is, well, tedious progression. I'm going to ask you to pick up or locate deities in a couple of passages from the play. The first is from Scene 3, or Act 1, Scene 3, between Laertes and Ophelia. This passage is from page 2010 of New Oxford Shakespeare. Pause the presentation and locate the deities. As you see, there were no less than 7. Thews and bulks, mind and soul, safety and health, voice and yielding, act and place, shot and danger, and in the morn and liquid dew of youth. Let's take another passage from 2 scenes later, Scenes 5, wherein Hamlet encounters his father's ghost. Once again, read this passage from page 2018 of your Hamlet. Pause the presentation and locate the deities. So in this case, there were 4, one of which is a run-on that enjambs 2 lines. Now, these are just examples from 2 passages from the play, but the deities is the dominant rhetorical figure of Hamlet, and as such, it does, I think, inform on its particular mindset. So exactly as with antithesis, keep an eye out for them. What I'd like to do next is explore some textual relations between the 3 versions of Hamlet. So here's the Hamlet stemma from Wells and Taylor's Textual Companion, showing the interrelations between the 3 historical editions. The 1603 first quarto in the middle right, the 1604-05 second quarto at left, and the 1623 folio at bottom right. The stemma shows how these 3 are related to 2 base texts. The first is Shakespeare's own manuscript, or his foul papers, and the second, the player's prompt book, from which they performed Hamlet. As I'd shown you before, the relative size of the 3 editions varies greatly, with the first quarto being little more than half the size of the second quarto, and the folio being about 200 lines shorter than the second quarto. But the story of Hamlet more or less remains the same throughout the 3 versions. Here I show in the middle the stages of the story. On the left, its breakdown into 19 or 20 scenes, along with the act scene breakdown established by Rowe and Capel in the 18th century. At right, in red, I show the main structural differences between Q1 and the other 2 versions. The to be or not to be, along with the nunnery scene between Hamlet and Ophelia, happens almost an act earlier in Q1, at the very top of scene 7. And Horatio's encounter with the sailors in scene 16 of Q2 is replaced in Q1 with a scene between Horatio and the Queen. So in Q1, the Queen is much more obviously made to side with her son, whereas in Q2 and F, it's far more ambiguous with whom she sides. Given its rather poor text of Hamlet, it is likely that Q1 was derived from performances, and as such may be revealing of Elizabethan stage practice. How, for instance, Elizabethan actors on tour would have cut and performed a much longer play. whereas Q2 is most likely derived from Shakespeare's manuscript, which, in the eyes of the New Oxford editors, gives it the most authority. Nowhere is it more obvious that Q1 is an abridgment of Hamlet than in its mangled version of To Be or Not to Be, which truly seems to be the result of an actor's very poor memory. On the left is a modern text transcription of Q1's To Be or Not to Be, and at right is an original spelling transcription of Q2. So do pause this presentation a moment and compare these two texts. This here is my attempt at comparing how the thematic contents of Q1 and Q2 match or fold into one another. I created little thematic pictograms, which are clearest, I think, in the bottom diagram, where you can see in the first scene a little ghost, in the second a crown, that's for the king, in the third a heart for the love of Hamlet and Ophelia, in the sixth is an eye for the theme of spying, and a fool's cap for Hamlet's madness. In the seventh scene, there's a broken heart of Ophelia, with at bottom the little masks of comedy and tragedy for the players. In the 11th scene, Corambus Polonius is crossed out because he dies. And in the 14th and 15th scenes, there's the pictogram of the letters that Hamlet sends to the queen and the king. Comparing the two pictograms, you can kind of see how some long stretches of Q2, for instance at scenes 11 to 14, are compressed in Q1. So you might want to perhaps pause the presentation here and have a closer look. As you study the three versions further, there seem to be more links between Q1 and F, as if Q1 were an abridgment not of Q2, but of the folio text. An example of this is what is indicated here by the little rectangle framing the appearance of Fortinbras and the captain in seat 14 of the play. This long speech here, how all occasions do inform against me, doesn't appear in the folio text, and neither is it in Q1. Nor do Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern appear at all in this scene as they do in Q2. So according to the stemma, the folio text itself is likely a transcript of the theatre's prompt book, which would have been the document most reflective of an accurate stage text of the play. But even though the folio is a substantially shorter text than Q2, it also contains added text that is not in Q2, text that might have been added in the course of the play's productions. A first example of this may be found in the course of Scene 7, or of Act 2, Scene 2, in the long exchange between Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. The Q2 text, as you find it in New Oxford Shakespeare, truly is a bit abrupt in the manner in which Hamlet all too quickly prods Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's intentions and motivations for coming to Elsinore, whereas the folio text allows us to see something of their old friendship. You might want to pause this and take a look at this text and see its difference from your text on page 2031 of the Oxford. A bit later in the same exchange is a passage that highlights both, an addition that might have come from rehearsal in order to give a polite nod to the company's clown, which had been rudely forgotten by the author, and the fact that Q1 comes from the same theatrical source as the folio, because the addition of the clown to this passage is also found in Q1. You might perhaps here pause and compare for yourself. Now, this next folio edition is a very famous one in that its little aeses seem to be a topical reference to the War of the Theatres. This passage, writes Frank Kermode in the Riverside Shakespeare, refers topically to the War of the Theatres between the child actors and their poet Ben Jonson, on the one side, and on the other, the adults with Dekker, Marston, and possibly Shakespeare as their spokesman. You might also pause this and read it for yourself. What's more, there is a similar reference to the child actors in Q1, or a little earlier in the text, And this further reinforces the link between folio and Q1 as being derived or influenced by actual rehearsals and performances. The topical reference that the audience of 1600 and 1601 would have recognized and nodded knowingly about is in both text, but not in the Q2 manuscript version, which would have been written earlier. My last example concerns the joke on dramatic genres that comes out of the long-winded Polonius Corambus. The folio text stretches the joke out, and it's even funnier. What this means is that the actor likely improvised, it worked, so they kept it. That comes from the stage. The next thing I'd like to address is a question that Brianna posted on the class forum. Now, in terms of Hamlet being monologue heavy, well, that's true enough. Personally, I think that what happened is that in the course of writing rewriting the old play, the character of Hamlet just took over. And it developed its own self-awareness, which probably completely surprised Shakespeare himself. And I suspect that it continues to surprise us because Hamlet is the most written about character in all of literature. So, in order to give some example of this, I just posted two books by Harold Bloom because I think they sum it up. Bloom thinks that our conception of being human actually comes from Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is the first to have delved into that particular inwardness whereby we recognize ourselves. And Hamlet, as a poem unlimited, is almost the beginning of something akin to a stream of consciousness. As for Brianna's suggestion that the play runs 4 hours, no way. As Q1 shows us, the play, even in its own time, was mercilessly cut. And here's another passage that kind of nutshells Hamlet's self-consciousness by Stephen Greenblatt from the Norton Shakespeare. You may pause and read it through. So that's it for Hamlet, except perhaps we may look at another text when next we meet.
Free me from history. Yeah. Free me from this tragedy. Set him free. Me from history. Yeah. And everything will be alright.